Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Apocrypha Apocalypse. I'm Gary Machuda, and in this episode, we're going to look at a recent discovery that was found in Yavne, and we're going to talk about the historical significance of that discovery right here on the Apocrypha Apocalypse. By the way, before we begin, if you've been enjoying this channel, enjoying the videos, please like, subscribe, tell your friends about it. We appreciate it. So fasten your seatbelts because the Apocrypha Apocalypse is about to begin. All right, so welcome back, everybody. And yeah, so this is going to be a short little episode regarding discovery made by Israeli archaeologists regarding the finding of the remains of the Sanhedrin in Yavne, which is in central Israel. And what's important here with Yavne is it's often anglicized as Jamnia. Okay, so the Sanhedrin in Jamnia. Now, some of you might be familiar with this. In fact, some of you might actually still hold this, even though it's been debunked for decades. The so-called Council of Jamnia that occurred in 100 AD. It was said that the rabbis gathered together in essentially what was like a Christian council, and they determined through conciliar decree what the rabbinic Bible would be. And that is the myth that was circulating. And like many myths, there are kernels of truth within it. There was rabbis in Jamnia. They did speak about the sacredness of certain books, but there wasn't a council per se. It was actually an ongoing Sanhedrin and an ongoing rabbinic school that took place there in Jamnia, and also it transferred to Usha and back to Jamnia a couple of times. So a very, very, very important deliberative body for post-Second Temple Judaism. And so they found the remains of the synagogue. So that's what I want to talk about. This comes from Crux News. You can get this at cruxnow.com. The article title is Israeli Archaeologists Find Remains Dating Back to Sanhedrin. And it's written by Charles Collins. It's put out November 30th, 2021. So it's kind of cool that, I love archaeological finds because often when we're dealing with historical sources, early church fathers, rabbinical sages, it's so easy for us to just think of them as these abstract figures, not people of flesh and bones that actually walk the earth. And that affects our scholarship because it's really easy to take these isolated early church fathers or rabbis and view them in isolation when actually, no, they were part of a community that really did live and walk about, in the areas in which they lived. So cool stuff. So I want to go through this article really quick. Just there's some good stuff in it, some things that they made a couple of mistakes, but nevertheless, at least I think it may be mistakes. So anyway, it says Israeli archaeologists have found the remains of a building dating back to the time of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish legislative body that existed in the Holy Land, New Testament times. It probably did exist back then, but don't confuse this with the Sanhedrin that met in Jerusalem. The remains were found in Yavne, located in central Israel. And of course, like I said, we're probably more familiar with it as Yavne or Jamnia. The city is where the Sanhedrin went into exile following the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And yeah, fascinating story about how in the first Jewish revolt, there was a rabbi, according to legend, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai. By the way, the Pharisees were not in favor of the first revolt. So they were known to Romans probably as people who are more aligned with the Romans than against them. So anyway, Rabbi ben Zakkai makes a deal with the Romans to allow him to escape and to set up a school in Jamnia. So after the destruction of the temple and the catastrophic revolts of that first failed rebellion of the Jews against the Romans, The center of Judaism effectively is moved from Jerusalem to Yavne or Jamnia. And so the Sanhedrin here is very, very important because now it becomes the center of religious, political, social cohesion within Judaism after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. And so we found the remains of the building in which this post-Christian, post-Second Temple Judaism kind of takes root. It says, for the first time ever in Yavne, the excavations revealed the industrial building dating from the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, said a statement in Israel Antiquities Authority. The floor contains several fragments of stoneware known as measuring cups, chalk vessels that retain their ritual purity and are identified with Jewish population in the late Second Temple period. In the 2nd century CE, an impressive cemetery was discovered only 70 meters away from the building. The statement continued, and the current excavation is done in conjunction with the expansion of the city, which has grown to a phenomenal rate since Israeli independence. So basically, as they're excavating, they're finding these materials. And again, this is on cruxnow.com. You can check out the article, look at the pictures. Very interesting. So why is this important with the Old Testament canon? Well, because I think, and I think the evidence points in this direction, that it was really under not Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, but a later head of the Sanhedrin, who is Akiva ben Joseph, who was behind the second Jewish revolt that happens within the first half of the second Christian century. And Rabbi Akiva, because he is the religious political leader, because he's in charge of the Sanhedrin in Yavne, and Yavne has become the center of Jewish cohesion, that he's responsible not only for starting the Bar Kokhba revolt, he names Simon to be the Messiah and launches this messianic revolt behind this false Messiah. So he's kind of a false prophet behind the false Messiah from a Christian perspective. And the revolt fails and ends with the execution of not only Bar Kokhba, but ultimately the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva as well. But that's not all. Rabbi Akiva was also responsible for taking oral traditions that were never written down in Judaism and placing them in writing. And so he begins to select from the oral traditions of the Jews which ones are to be preserved after the destruction of the temple. And this lays the groundwork for a very important rabbinic document known as the Mishnah. And so Rabbi Akiva begins the formation of the Mishnah, which is ultimately completed about 200 AD under Rabbi Meir. And also, it seems also during his reign as the head of the Sanhedrin, that he adopts a single normative text for Judaism. Now, as we learn through Qumran and other discoveries, that there wasn't a normative biblical text within Judaism, just like there wasn't a normative biblical canon per se. Many different sects of Judaism had their own views about the extent of sacred writings. And so circulated, for example, with the Septuagint was one of the major Greek translations. There were several Hebrew manuscripts in circulation. We know that through Qumran and other ones as well. So Rabbi Akiva adopts a single Hebrew text as the normative text because now Pharisees have become predominant amongst the surviving sects of that first revolt. And basically, I believe that Hebrew text becomes a kind of Procrustean bed on which the canon is made. So whatever books were included within the normative text, those are affirmed as sacred, and whichever books were excluded or not part of that particular text tradition are excluded from sacred scripture. So in a sense, Rabbi Akiva effectively closes the rabbinic canon, and it's actually later than the myth of the Council of Jamnia, because the myth says that this happened in 100 AD. I would place the closing probably closer to 132 AD, near the end of, somewhere, around the beginning or the end of the second Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt. So we actually found a place where this closing probably took place under Akiva. So this is pretty exciting and very relevant to this channel. We mentioned the cemetery that was also unearthed not far from it. It's not very clear, according to the article, whether these are Jewish bodies or pagan bodies or what exactly is in the cemetery. Continuing with the article, it says, quote, "The three rabbis were very influential in Jewish life in the New Testament era." And they named these three rabbis, let's see, which would be Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, Rabbi Akiva, that we just mentioned, and Rabban Gamaliel. Okay, it's a statement from the Israeli Authority. So they say, hey, there are some very ornamented tombs, and perhaps it's one of those sages. Just scrolling down to see if there's any pertinent stuff. The article mentions, and this is not the Israeli Authority, but the author says the three rabbis were influential in Jewish life in the New Testament era, and Gamaliel was featured in the Acts of the Apostles. That's actually, I believe that's an error, because, I don't know how influential Yohanan ben Zakkai was during the New Testament era. I guess it depends how you define New Testament era. If you believe Revelation was written in the 90s, he was influential, absolutely, and he would be part of the New Testament era. Akiva is more towards the end. I don't know if he would be included within that time. And Rabban Gamaliel, now I'm not really sure about this, okay? If you're talking about the Rabban Gamaliel that's mentioned in the book of Acts, this probably would not be Rabban Gamaliel, because Rabban Gamaliel died in the 50s. So, I mean, maybe he did die in Yavne, and maybe his tomb is there in Yavne. Gamaliel that actually worked and wrote, and that we have writings from in rabbinic sources, is actually Gamaliel's grandson. So I think this was an error by the author, that he got Gamaliel, I think it's Gamaliel II, confused with his grandfather. But so that it happens. But nevertheless, it still is a spectacular find, very interesting stuff. And he says that there are files were probably used to keep precious liquids, such as fragrant oils, that were found. And exciting stuff, and very, very relevant to the Deuterocanon and the closure of the rabbinic canon. And this couldn't have come at a more timely time, because basically we're looking at rabbinic documents. We're seeing how Ben Sira, the book of Sirach, has shown that at least one rabbi included it among the third division of the Jewish scripture, the rabbinic Bible. We saw how some rabbinic sages quote Sirach with formal introductions. And we also saw how Protestant scholars such as Lee MacDonald notes that this is an indication that the rabbinic canon hadn't really been closed. And I don't know if I would go that far. I would say it hadn't become standardized, because I believe there was a closure that took place under Akiva around 132, 135 AD. So this is long after the time of Christ, long after the ascension, long after the death of the apostles, and the gospel has gone out into the world. So this is has no influence on Christianity. It's all post-Christian closing, but nevertheless, very, very important for understanding the Old Testament canon. So that's the article. Check it out, folks. I'll put the link in the description box, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.